Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. Today I want to do a really quick chat about the most recent book that I finished. It is called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and it's by Ibram X. Kendi. This was published in last year, 2016. This actually won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. And that's actually how I heard about the book originally. I was messing around on YouTube, as I sometimes do, killing time, randomly watching things, and I came across the author, Ibram X. Kendi, accepting the National Book Award for Nonfiction. And I thought, so I watched the video and I thought, okay, this book sounds like really something that I need to get on my 2017 TBR, which I was at that time, constructing. And I thought, okay, I need to get this book on my 2017 TBR because I do need to get this book read fairly soon. And I'm really glad that I did. It's rather hefty. It's I read electronically, but it's just so easy to read that it didn't feel like a really long book. I think though, when I saw it on Amazon, I think it's something like maybe 500, 600 pages. So it's pretty big. But like I said, it's very easy to read, and the way it's divided up, it makes it really engaging to read. This is a history of racist ideas, so not necessarily a history of racism, but a history of racist ideas, particularly here in the U.S., and specifically racist ideas towards African Americans here in the U.S. Even though racist ideas against Africans, racist ideas of Africans did not originate here necessarily in the U.S. It began, though, I was interested to learn, really there really wasn't even a concept of white and versus black until really the late 15th century, like the late 1400s and the 1500s particularly, it really kind of took off. And there were several reasons for that. For one, it was the age of Enlightenment. So it was a scientific era where there was exploration. The Europeans had just recently, quote unquote, discovered the Western Hemisphere and were in the process of colonizing the Western Hemisphere and exploiting those resources. And they needed a large labor pool, and they needed it quickly. There existed slavery already. If you've seen some of my books on ancient history, I've talked before about the slavery that existed really since the dawn of time and existed all throughout time, actually, throughout the classical world, and then all throughout, it's never stopped. But that sort of source of slaves from Central Europe and Eastern Europe and North Africa was harder to get, and so with the Enlightenment and the increase in the technology of transportation, it became possible to start they were starting to explore Africa as well, and that's where the new source of slavery, the slaves, were ultimately found, and it took off in an industrial scale. And so, the ideas to support that, the racist ideas to sort of support that economic structure and that structure of slavery, followed right along. And then in the United States here, it really got perfected to a science, and it instilled virtually every aspect of our early culture, and continues right up until this very day to affect our culture through really these insidious ideas of racism that they're traceable. They're ideas that are perfectly traceable. This book actually does a fantastic job of doing that, and it's broken up, as I mentioned, into 5 different components, and each of these 5 components, these 5 parts, have sort of a guide. It's a person who the author chose as sort of to focus on, and through focusing on this one individual during an era, we can therefore get a picture of the racist ideas as they played out during that era. So the very first part is our guide in this first part is Cotton Mather, the Puritan theologian from the colonial era, the very early, the early before the Revolution, and he was sort of instrumental in the theology of slavery, because it was really rooted in a lot of biblical ideas, or he rooted it in a lot of biblical ideas here in the U.S. And then our second part is the leader, our guide there is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder himself, although he was, a proponent of the Enlightenment. He speaks sometimes very anti-racist. He writes very anti-racist thoughts and ideas, and then at the same time he's a slaveholder, and he's very segregationalist sometimes, and so he actually exhibited sort of a complex behavior, but ultimately he was a slaveholder, and was up until the day, up until he died. So he's the second part two, and then part three is William Lloyd Garrison, who is who was actually a really noted anti-abolitionist, or he was an abolitionist, not an anti-abolitionist, he was an anti-slavery abolitionist, sort of starting the early 19th century when the abolition of slavery movement was getting going, and then, he continued his work on throughout Reconstruction, even the end of the Civil War, and then Reconstruction. And then we pick up in part four with W.E.B. DuBois, who was an African-American intellectual who was writing around 1900, so the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of institutionalized segregation and the Jim Crow laws. And he's with us and elucidates sort of the first half of the 20th century. I think he died in like 1963. And then part five is actually sort of focused on Angela Davis, who began her career as a African-American intellectual in the late 60s, and she was part of, Black Pride movement, the Black Panthers, this sort of advocating for a greater equality and greater political strength, I guess, of African Americans. So, and her arc actually continues on to this day as well. So the book, as I mentioned, really it really sort of trails off in the 90s. It does go into a little bit in the 21st century, so it does talk a little bit about the election of Obama, but not much. Mostly, it's really focused, I would say, on the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. But it was very informative to see these racist ideas, to have them picked apart and just sort of unpack the idea of racism, where it came from, how it evolved over time, the different, and it's multiple armed. This was another point that the book makes, is that maybe one racist sort of idea is ultimately discarded by the culture at large, but then another one seems to spring up. So it's multi-pronged. There have always been, anti-racists, though, to speak up. Their voices haven't always been heard. They haven't always been, that many of them, but they have always been there, including in the colonial times, all the way through, obviously to the present. But the other sort of idea I don't think I mentioned was there's three kind of main thrusts. One is of racist and anti-racist idea. One is a segregationist. These are people who want segregationists feel like there's a structural inequality between whites and blacks, and so therefore they're always going to be separate, and there's no point in trying to make it otherwise. And that's typically what goes along with that, is that the whites are superior and the blacks are inferior. And then the other second idea is assimilationism, assimilationists. And this has been all the way from William Lloyd Garrison, really before William Lloyd Garrison even. But this is the idea that, blacks, African Americans will be improved, if they if they try to assimilate with the dominant culture. So the more that they can assimilate into the dominant culture, the better off that they will be. And that's assimilationist. And an anti-racist idea is basically just rejecting racist ideas to begin with, flat out, and then understanding that African Americans don't need to assimilate. They don't need to be any different than they are. They're fine perfectly the way that they are, and they don't need to change in order to succeed. That the problem is not them. The problem is the structure of society. So that's sort of the three kind of themes that keep running through this history throughout all 5 of these parts. And really, a lot of people exhibit at different times in their lives, like for example W.E.B. DuBois founded the NAACP, or was one of the founders of the NAACP here in the U.S. And, he was early on rather an assimilationist, where he thought like through education and through, proving to white people that, black people had the intellectual ability to be just as successful as they are, would then end racism. And of course, it doesn't, because the bar keeps being moved. And so really the only way to end racist ideas is through anti-racism, ultimately, is the point of the book. So, I'm going to run out of time, so I wanted to just quickly, my thoughts. One of the main thoughts I thought about was this quote from Seneca, which is one of my all-time favorite quotes, and it is, the mind unlearns with great difficulty what it has long learned. And that is the fact that it's very difficult, he's saying here that it's very difficult to unlearn something that's been learned. And racist ideas is something that's not consciously learned by most people. Most people absorb it from the culture around them. And so, it's very difficult to then unlearn that. But it is possible. But the anti-racist message there is that, African Americans don't need to change. Just like women don't need to be more like men to be, who they are and to be successful. Gays don't have to try to act straight in order to be who they are and to be successful. African Americans don't have to be white or act white in order to be successful and to be who they are. The problem is not with these individual groups. The problem is not with African Americans. It's actually with the structure of our society. So I just wanted to end on a couple of quotes from the book itself. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to read one real quick. The very end of the book, the last paragraph of the book, I just thought was kind of cool. So I'll just share that directly from the words of the author, Ibram X. Kendi. There will come a time when Americans will realize that the only thing wrong with black people is that they think something is wrong with black people. There will come a time when racist ideas will no longer obstruct us from seeing the complete and utter abnormality of racial disparities. There will come a time when we will love humanity, when we will gain the courage to fight for an equitable society for our beloved humanity, knowing intelligently that when we fight for humanity, we are fighting for ourselves. There will come a time, maybe, just maybe, the time is now. So I thought that was a good quote. Cool quote. I love this book. I'm really super glad that I got it on my 2017 TBR and got it read. It was well worth it. I learned a lot. I didn't have a chance to go into a lot of the details. There's a lot more details in the book. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend it. I will put also a link to Ibram X. Kendi accepting the National Book Award, which is the video that I saw that prompted me to read the book. So that's it. Until next time, take care.